The more Chinese you learn, the less noticeable your progress becomes. Benchmarking can make your improvements more visible and help you stay motivated. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about benchmarking and how it can help you keep track of how much you learn and how much progress you make over time. When we start learning Chinese, everything feels new and exciting, and everything we learn also has a very big impact on what we can do in the language, and so improvements are felt very keenly, and for most people this is a strong source of motivation. You can feel that your proficiency has improved since last week, and for most people this is highly motivating. It wants us to engage more with the language and become even better. This is great for beginners, but it has a darker side too, because when you leave the beginner stage and start approaching the intermediate level and maybe even the advanced level, this noticeable progress becomes less and less noticeable, and you reach the intermediate plateau, where no matter how much time you invest, it seems like you are no longer moving forward, you are not learning, and this can be very demotivating instead. So how can you keep the motivation to learn when you seem to no longer be learning things? There are many ways of answering this question, and first and foremost, most people might not be learning languages only to feel that they improve in that language. There are other reasons to study Chinese as well. In self-determination theory, which we talked about in episode 188, there are three basic psychological needs that underpin all human behavior. They are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy means that you are in control and can meaningfully impact the situation you are in. So we might expect someone who has chosen to learn Chinese of their own free will and also has chosen the goals they have for learning and also the methods they use to try to reach these goals would be more motivated than someone who has had Chinese forced on them and have to use a method used in a specific curriculum by a certain teacher or textbook or something like that. Competence is about feeling that you are able to operate effectively within the activities you perform, using Chinese in this case. That means that the tasks that you set for yourself are reasonable, you use language in a way that works, and you don't feel that everything is super hard or super easy. This is not about absolute language ability, so a beginner can feel competent in certain situations using the Chinese they've learned, and an advanced student can equally well feel inadequate and incompetent in a situation because their Chinese is not adequate to deal with it. Finally, relatedness is about connecting with other people and finding meaning in social relationships of different kinds, which is of course close to the heart of language learning. I mean, we learn languages to communicate after all. The reason I mention the psychological needs here is that it's only the second one, competence, which is about how well you perform in the language. And part of this is, of course, feeling that you are performing better than you used to, and this can be a very powerful motivator, as I just said. The other two are about completely different things, and they can be strong sources of motivation too. Maybe you want to learn Chinese to listen to something specific, or to read something interesting, or connect with people, talk with someone special, and so on. And then your main motivation doesn't come from this gradual improvement that you feel as a beginner. Then when you reach the intermediate stage, you will not necessarily feel this intermediate plateau as clearly because your main motivation for learning wasn't really to feel better, but to do something else. Still though, I think most people do experience the intermediate plateau. You have some way of gauging how you're doing. Maybe you talk with people, maybe you do some things that you want to use Chinese for, and you start noticing that you're learning less and less, or at least that's the way it seems. I talked a lot more about the intermediate plateau in episode 48, including how to get past it, but to summarize briefly, I think the plateau is largely a cognitive illusion. The problem is not that you've stopped learning, it is just that you've stopped noticing the progress, because compared to what you already know, every single new thing you learn is not that significant. This is just a natural effect of knowing more about something, and there's nothing wrong with it. Let's have a look at a concrete example just to show you what I mean. If you know 10 words in Mandarin, learning another 10 words will double your vocabulary, and this dramatically increases what you can do with the language. This means that as a beginner, going from 10 words to 20 words will feel very different. It's very noticeable. Now let's jump ahead in time to when you know 1,000 words. And now learning 10 words only increases your vocabulary with 1%. I think we can all agree that a difference of 100% is very significant, but that a difference in 1% might be hard to notice. It's not just that though, because the more words you learn, the less frequently used the words you learn will be. So words 1 through 10 will be very common and used all the time, but words 1000 to 1010 will not be as commonly used, and so you're even less likely to notice the impact they have on your ability to communicate in Chinese. For example, the 11th most common character in Chinese is 这, meaning this, and knowing this character will of course help you immensely when trying to read and write. Character 1001 is 玉, jade, and as I'm sure you'll agree, this character is still useful to know, but not as useful as this. And knowing it will improve your ability to communicate in Chinese, but not as much. So to summarize, if you keep engaging with the language, it's likely that you are still learning even if it doesn't feel like that. And this is where benchmarking comes in, which is the main topic for this episode. Benchmarking is a way to make progress more visible, either to strengthen your motivation and to show you that you are in fact learning things, or to help you evaluate the methods that you use to improve when it comes to Chinese. When you're no longer a beginner, each step you take will be short in comparison to the distance you have already traveled, and then having some way of measuring this distance can be helpful. This is akin to watching the shadow the sun casts on the ground. If you watch it, even intently, you will not see the shadow moving, but if you put a mark at the edge of the shadow and return an hour later, you can clearly see that the shadow has moved, and indeed we all know that the sun moves across the sky every day, even if it does so imperceptibly slowly. So the idea here is to do the same with language ability as I just described with the shadow. You put a mark where you are now, you return sometime later, and you will be able to see that you have in fact moved from that previous position. The first thing you need to do is to set a baseline. You need to know where you are now, and then later, maybe a month from now, maybe 2, maybe a year, you will then compare a future performance with your performance today. I strongly suggest that you limit your benchmarking to specific areas, such as, say, pronunciation, reading speed, character knowledge, and things like that, rather than your Chinese ability in general. Evaluating language proficiency is notoriously hard, and there is no realistic way that you can just assess everything at once. Even if you have access to professional help, this is very complex and hard to do. Before we move on to how to benchmark different areas of Chinese learning, let's have a look at something that I think might have come to mind for some listeners as well, and that is using proficiency exams like the HSK or TOCFL. Can't you use these exams to evaluate your ability and then redo the exams later and see if you've improved? Yes, you can, but you also need to be aware that even if these tests purport to test your overall ability, they really don't. It's a small selection of your ability and it's tested in a very specific way, which means that some things that you value might not be tested and some things that you don't value will be tested. If you're after some general reading and listening comprehension assessment, I think signing up for these exams might work well. For example, when I lived in Taiwan, I took every opportunity I could to sit the TOCFL because I realized it was a valuable benchmarking resource. Fortunately, I could do this largely for free at least once or twice per semester because they were trying out a new system and they wanted to have volunteer students. Still, be mindful that these proficiency exams don't cover everything you might want to learn. And this is something I covered in episode 129. As usual, I'll put links in the show notes to these episodes that I mention. Let's now continue discussing benchmarking of specific abilities or aspects of the Chinese language, so we're no longer talking about proficiency exams, but things you can do on your own. Let's start with a list of things to keep in mind that are true for all these areas. First, like I already mentioned, you need to document your current skill. And this means that you perform certain things in these areas and you write down as much as you can about the result, about the method, what you did, how it went, and so on. And you can then compare this at a later date. To make this comparison consistent though, you need to make sure you use consistent materials. For example, if you're checking reading speed, you need to make sure you're reading texts that are equally difficult. Otherwise, if you choose difficult text the second time, of course your reading speed will not have improved. I mean, it might have improved, but since the text is harder, you will still read slower. Also make sure to make notes about the method you use for benchmarking. So this essentially involves writing down how you checked your proficiency, because you're going to use this in a few months and it's quite likely that you will not remember exactly how you did. And if you don't remember it, you can't replicate it, and so the results will not be very useful. Finally, be realistic. This is not meant to be a scientific experiment, although you can certainly learn a lot from experimental design if you happen to be into that. But the goal here is not to, through science, advance our understanding of language acquisition. It is simply to help you understand where you are now and how much you have learned until some future date. And for that, you don't need to get everything right, but you do need to keep things as consistent as possible. So let me now share some ideas for how to benchmark reading, writing, listening, and speaking in Chinese. I'm not going to cover vocabulary here, because if you're after the number of characters you know or the words you've studied or something like that, this is very easy to keep track of in apps like, say, Skritter, Anki, or Pleco. There will be a number that says how many you've learned, and so this is not tricky to figure out how to keep track of. But how do you benchmark reading ability, for example? It's actually quite easy. You can do it on your own and you don't need input from anybody else. There are many things you could potentially benchmark. For example, how long does it take to read a text at a given length and at a certain difficulty and understand everything said in it? You could also do the same, but reading for the gist and trying to understand the general ideas, although this is maybe a little bit more hazy. Or you could try to explore different genres and see how you react when you encounter Chinese you haven't prepared for that much. When you benchmark reading in one of these ways, or maybe some other way that you come up with, there are a few metrics that you can keep track of as well. So first is your subjective gauge of comprehension. So after reading this text, how much did you understand and how long did it take you to reach that understanding? You could also write down how often you needed to use a dictionary, if you used a dictionary at all, or just how long it took you to complete the text if you were reading for, say, the gist. Another thing I think can be valuable to write down is just to subjectively describe your experience when reading. And this is not very scientific or objective, but if you do it now, and if you do it in a few months from now, you can compare your thoughts and how did you feel when you read this type of text. And you might see that your approach or your attitude or experience might have changed quite a lot. If you want to benchmark reading speed specifically, you should check out episode 172, Chinese Reading Speed Revisited. I have also written an article on Hacking Chinese about improving your ability to read aloud, and so I put a link to that in the show notes as well. In general, I don't think that benchmarking reading ability is very hard. The texts are easy to access, and it's just easy to deal with text, which is not true for spoken language. So let's now turn to listening. Spoken language is of course more ephemeral than written language, but we do have digital recordings and I think many people use these to improve their listening ability already. So listening to recorded content is good here because it allows you to listen to the same content later, or at least make sure you have content at a comparable level. If you want much more information and inspiration about listening ability, you can also check out my course, The Fluent Listener, and I'll put a link to that in the show note as well. When benchmarking listening ability, there are many things you could check. And remember, the idea here is not necessarily to check all of these. I'm just showing you some options that you have. For example, are you benchmarking spontaneous or scripted language? So is it essentially an interview or is it a scripted dialogue? These things feel very different and your ability to understand them is quite likely different too. Are you listening only once or are you allowed to listen more than once? And if so, how many times? This can make listening much easier, as we talked about in episode 164, so keep track of how many times you listen as well. Listening is also different if you are involved in the conversation yourself or if you're just listening to a recorded dialogue. Other things that can influence your listening is if it's informal or formal Chinese, or how accented the Mandarin you're listening to is. In general, you can use the same metrics as for reading, so that's your subjective comprehension, how many unknown words there are, time to reach full comprehension, and then number of listens, not number of minutes, of course, because that's fixed when you listen, or your emotional response, what did it feel like listening to this passage. Just like with reading, if enough time passes between the first and second benchmark, you can actually use the same content. So you listen to something, write down what you think, and you wait 3 months and then listen to the same thing. And if you haven't touched this for 3 months, it's very unlikely you will remember anything at all. And you can then look at your notes earlier to see what you thought that at that time, and then you see what do I feel about it now. And hopefully you will feel that it's easier to deal with now compared with 3 months ago. Okay, let's move on to writing ability. This is trickier to do on your own, and you do need some kind of external feedback. The reason is that you at your current level cannot evaluate how good your writing is. Well, you could maybe do that in the future, so if you wait a year and you look back at your old writing, you might say, okay, I have definitely improved since then, because I can spot many things I did wrong back then that I wouldn't do right now. And so then you know that you've improved. But in general, to evaluate writing and speaking ability, you need feedback of some kind. Before we talk about feedback though, let's look at a few strategies you can use when benchmarking writing ability. First, I think it's a great idea to start a blog or journal or diary or something in Chinese, where you write about what you do, what you think about, or basically anything you want, but you write regularly. It might be every day a little bit, maybe once a week, it doesn't really matter, but you do it regularly. Naturally, this doesn't need to be public. You can just have a text file on your computer or maybe a physical diary that you write in. That is completely fine. Just like with listening and reading, it's worthwhile to think about what you want to improve, which are the factors that you're interested in. Are you interested in, say, a formal style or informal style? What kind of genre are we talking about? Are you writing fiction and stories, or essays, or reports, or accounts of what happened yesterday? Or what are you writing and what do you want to improve? Also take into account how much help you have when you write. So for example, writing without a dictionary is clearly harder than writing with a dictionary. And if you have access to the internet, it becomes even easier. And that is something you need to make a record of, so that when you want to compare later, you make sure you use the same type of support. So you can see if you have actually learned something or if there is some difference in how much you relied on tools. One final thing to consider is typing versus handwriting. So if you're not interested in handwriting, it doesn't make sense to benchmark using pen and paper, and then you just save your writing on your computer, easy. If you do want to evaluate handwriting as well, then of course it does make sense to also write by hand. Before we move on to speaking, I'd like to say a few more things about feedback. And like I said, it is essential to get feedback unless you wait a very long time. Like I said, if you wait a year, you're likely to be able to spot things you did wrong a year ago, but this is rather hard and it's not something you can do right now. So if you just write something and read it, you probably will not be able to evaluate how good it is. This is also true for speaking, so if you record yourself and listen, you will hear some things that you notice are off, that you didn't hear when you were speaking because you were busy doing all the other things you need to do when speaking, but this does not mean that you can evaluate your own speaking or your own pronunciation. Again, if you invest enough effort and wait long enough, you will be able to notice a difference. So of course, if I take an audio recording of myself from 15 years ago, I will obviously notice big differences in how I speak Chinese. But if you wait a week or a month, maybe there won't be any noticeable difference. And no matter what, it's extremely hard to quantify or describe your ability yourself. What you can do instead is to ask a native speaker, preferably a teacher, but an ordinary person might work as well. You can also try generative AI for this, and as of this recording, which is December 2024, these AI are not very good at referring to specific frameworks, so you can't just give it a text and ask it to evaluate it according to the CEFR or something like that. But you could presumably give it two different texts and ask it to compare them. Which one is the most natural, which one uses the most varied language, and which one is just better in terms of what conforms to how native speakers would write. This is not something I have had time to explore in detail, but feel free to try it out, and if you do let me know. To see if you have improved, you can compare samples directly. I think that's probably the best solution. You can also ask your teacher, or perhaps the AI, to highlight recurring errors and compare them between different benchmarks, or just try to evaluate your overall progress between the two benchmarks. One thing to remember here that's likely true regardless if you're asking a teacher or an AI is that if you ask teacher A to do an evaluation at benchmark 1, and then you ask teacher B to do another evaluation at benchmark 2, you're unlikely to get very helpful results. They will certainly have different ideas of what is good, and they are just different in how they regard language, what is important, what isn't, and so on. There are two solutions to this problem. Either you rely on the same teacher twice, or the same chatbot twice, although that's quite likely to be harder considering how quickly these models update. But the simpler solution is simply to compare, as I said. You ask the second teacher, or the teacher at benchmark 2, to compare the texts in benchmark 1 and 2. And you don't have to tell them which one is which, just ask them to compare these texts and note down any differences. Moving on to speaking ability, which is perhaps the hardest thing to benchmark, because it is production, which you said is harder than reception, and it's also about the spoken language, which is more fleeting than the written language. And indeed, that's the first thing we need to do. We need to record. And if you haven't recorded your voice and you still feel that it sounds weird listening to yourself, it means you haven't done it enough. You should record yourself a lot and listen to what your Chinese sounds like. In the beginning, this will feel very awkward and your voice sounds so strange, but I promise you that the more you do this, the more you will get used to it. And for example, I have listened to my own voice for hundreds and hundreds of hours and no longer feel it's weird at all. As I mentioned earlier, you will notice some things that you didn't when you were speaking. I mean, even if you listen to your recording right after recording it, and that is a valid learning strategy in itself. But the main thing we're after here is recording something at point 1 and then returning to and talking about the same thing at point 2. Again, you can vary the topic, genre, and so on and so forth. We've discussed this already, but there are a few extra strategies I think you can employ for speaking specifically. First, it matters how much you prepare and how close this is to your best performance. So for example, if you want to record your best performance, you should practice, you should prepare, and then you record. If you're not happy, you record again and again until you are happy. And if you do that, naturally you need to do that when you do benchmark 2 later, because otherwise it's unfair. This is not the only way to do it though. You might actually want to record your casual performance. You're not interested in the best performance, but how you do when you don't prepare, and that's in a way easier. And then of course you need to remember that, so next time you do the second benchmark, you need to also be equally casual. You're not allowed to prepare and redo things you're not happy with. Other things to keep in mind is that reading aloud is not the same as speaking yourself, and improvising things in a conversation is not the same thing as having an oral report or presentation either. One technique I particularly want to recommend here is to use voice messaging. So most social media apps these days have these voice snippets or voice messages that you can send to each other. And if you have friends or maybe your teacher on social media, you can send messages to them. And you can use this to communicate with them normally, of course, but the added benefit here is that you can go back and listen to your own messages. They are kept. And if they are not kept, you need to figure out some way to keep them. But the point is that the voice messages are recorded and you can then listen back to them even weeks or months later. Just like with writing, feedback matters a lot, and when you give your recording to someone to evaluate it, it can help to focus on something specifically, and not just when they evaluate it, but also when you record it. For example, you want to improve your tones. Well, then let this person know that tones are what you're focusing on and you can ignore everything else. Or if you're working on sounding less robotic, well, let them know that so they don't comment on, say, your word choice, because it's not very helpful if you are focusing on something and somebody else keeps pointing out things that are completely unrelated to what you are focusing on. Another thing you can do is check out my pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com, where there is an added option where you can get feedback from me, which also includes follow-up feedback at a later point to see how you have done. So let's wrap this episode up by looking at a few general tips that are basically true for all these types of benchmarking and things I've mentioned throughout the episode, but I want you to take with you when you benchmark your Chinese. The first one is to make sure you save your records and organize them in some way. It's sometimes amazing how much you forget in just a month, so make sure you save things where you can find them and have the notes somewhere where they don't get lost. Next, make sure you stay consistent. It doesn't matter what variables you choose to manipulate here, but if you change too many of them between one benchmark point and the next, it means you are probably not testing what you want to test. If the text you read the second time you benchmark is considerably harder than the text you read the first time, it will not look like you made a lot of progress, even though you might have. You should also expect progress to take time. I've talked about weeks and months, but if you are an advanced student, it could take longer than that, especially if you're focusing on a very big area, such as speaking. You are then better off to focus on something more limited, where you can expect to reach some kind of progress in weeks or months. Finally, celebrate small wins. Half the point of benchmarking is to stay motivated, and well, the other half is maybe to help you evaluate the methods you're using, but motivation is one of the key reasons to benchmark in the first place. So when you notice that you've made progress, celebrate. Pat yourself on the back and feel good about the progress that you've made, even though it didn't feel like you were moving at all. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.